I still every day feel humbled and blessed to have the opportunity to be able to serve you. And I just want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. So, can you hear me now? Is that working? Is that working? All right, so let me set this down. I don't know what I'm going to do with my two hands not holding that in here. But before I get started on here, I've got to give you my 2 cents on the issue that Ray brought up. Because there was nobody more passionate about this than myself and Kay. She went to Ohio with several of you in the freezing 0-degree weather and walked. And we had our choice. But I'm going to tell you this twice tonight on 2 different subjects. But when you leave here in between now and the election, you are going to make a choice. You have no choice in that. You will make a choice that either you will help Hillary get elected or you will help defeat Hillary. That's the bottom line. That's the only 2 things that will happen. And you'll do one of 3 things to make one of those 2 happen. Either you will actually vote for Hillary, or you won't do anything at all and you won't vote, or you will vote for Trump. 2 out of those 3, you are helping Hillary get elected. The race with the 16 is over. The race that had others in it, Scott Walker, Santorum, Cruz, all the rest of them, that isn't in this now. And a vote for Trump is no endorsement of Trump. It is an indictment on Hillary. And we either get one or the other. But if you think our country would be better off with Hillary, then don't vote or vote for Hillary. That's the bottom line. I will never step up and endorse Trump as someone I think should be our leader, but only have 2 choices right now. And I can tell you, and if you haven't seen the movie Hillary's America, you need to go see that. You need to go see who the Democratic Party really is. Need to see what they have done and where they have brought it. And I'm not worried about stepping on any toes, because if you're in here and you're a Democrat, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You honestly should be ashamed of yourself, because the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. They started, they made it. It was the Republican Party that fought against it. It was the Democratic Party that helped Margaret Sanger get started for the sole purpose of killing black babies. That was the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party created the Ku Klux Klan. And you know what? It's the same party in 1856 as it is today. It's the same party that Woodrow Wilson screened the movie Birth of a Nation, which exalted and exonerated the Ku Klux Klan. So, and it was Lyndon Johnson, when he decided to push for the Civil Rights Bill. It's well recorded, and if you haven't seen it, his statement was, "We're going to pass this because when we pass it, there will be no black will vote for a Republican for 200 years. That was their reason for doing it. So you will make a choice, and it'll be one or the other. So I'm going to get off that soapbox now in here. But that's my humble opinion, and God help us. All right, let me ask you a question. How many of you are aware of the issue of the EMP threat? How many of you think this is a serious threat? Well, shoot, I might as well go home. What's there to say? Let me ask you, 18 months ago, how many of you knew about this? How about 2 years ago? 5 years ago? This threat, 5 years ago. Okay, all right. Well, it's been around a lot longer than that. Matter of fact, at least 10 times that long, 50 years ago. How many of you knew about it 50 years ago? Okay. All right. Okay. Go ahead. Next slide here. You know, this has been around for quite a while, and it is probably about the most debilitating threat that there is to our country. And it's an interesting combination of probably the most serious and at the same time the easiest to accomplish. That's a tough combination. And we are here today because of two things that have happened. The advance in technology that has given us the life we have today, that makes everything so easy to do, and so many aids that we have in doing it, in the advance of technology and our dependence on electricity, and the change in the geopolitical environment to grow to the where we now have what we have. I mean, if you haven't noticed, this is no longer the Leave It to Beaver world that we grew up in. It has changed radically. The threat to us is significant. We are no longer only concerned about the Russians or the Chinese, which for years and years and years, that was the big threat, and everybody thought about the way to take down America was through the Russians or the Chinese. Next slide. Let me tell you a little bit about my background so you'll understand where I'm coming from. And Ray mentioned that I had some experience with this. My experience goes back more than 50 years. Back when I was a junior captain in the Air Force. And I'll tell you that this is one of the things that was a wake-up call to me to truly understand God's hand in our life. Just like no one is sitting in this room tonight, by accident, you're all here for a reason. You may not know what that reason is tomorrow, the next day, next week, next month, but sometime there will be a reason that will come about. Because my experience with this should have never happened if it was left up to me. My plan, when I graduated from the Citadel, was to be a fighter pilot. That's what I worked so hard for. But that was not what God's plan was. And I didn't like it, I can tell you, because when I took my last physical just before graduation, I didn't pass. I had 20/25 vision. And they said, no fighter planes for you, son. You're going to be on the ground. And so I got sent to California to be an engineer on the Minuteman missile program, kind of a default assignment. And shouldn't have been done. I shouldn't have been sent there either, because they really weren't taking junior officers. As a matter of fact, they were only accepting senior captains at the least, and they really wanted majors and lieutenant colonels experience because the development of the strategic missile system was so important. But I showed up with orders, and they didn't know what to do. I was the second lieutenant engineer to be assigned to the Minuteman missile program. That should have never happened. The other next step that should have never happened is I got assigned to the ground electronics system, command and control. This was the silos, the launch facilities, the launch control facilities, the equipment that controlled everything on the ground and then launched the missile. The missile itself was in a completely different office. We kept them separated. Well, after I'd been there about 3.5 years, some folks from the Pentagon showed up one day and said that there was a new threat against Minuteman, a brand new threat, and it had to be fixed. They had to protect the missile from this threat. And they went on to describe what it was. And what had happened is in 1962, we were conducting high-altitude nuclear testing. Our bombs had gotten so big, and the people blowing them out in the desert in Las Vegas, the people in Nevada got really mad every time they set one off. Their windows were broken, knocked stuff off the shelf. They didn't like that. And so they decided to start doing it in outer space. And so we would launch a nuclear weapon on a missile and detonate it a couple hundred nautical miles above the Earth. Well, at the same time, the Russians were doing exactly the same thing, because theirs were getting big just as fast as ours were. But what was happening was every time we launched one, and set it off, we were knocking out the power systems in the island, power grid. Well, the Russians were doing it over Kazakhstan, and they were knocking out the power system on the mainland Russia. They knew they couldn't keep testing. We knew we couldn't keep testing, but we didn't know what the Russians knew, and they didn't know what we knew, but we knew we had to stop, so they had to stop too, and vice versa. And so we got together and very quickly had a high-altitude nuclear test ban treaty that stopped that. But the threat was there when they realized that our Minuteman missile in powered flight, which was about 6 minutes of powered flight, 3 stages, and then it would throw the warhead towards its target, was very vulnerable to what was called the EMP, electromagnetic pulse. And this is a pulse that's generated, and I'll probably get ahead, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides, but it fits to tell you about it right now. But when a nuclear weapon is detonated in outer space, there are no kinetics. That is, there's no force. It's just a nuclear reaction, very bright light for nanoseconds, but it does put off a huge amount of gamma rays. And when those gamma rays hit the Earth's atmosphere, they knock the electrons off of the particles in the atmosphere. Those electrons, they interact with the Earth's magnetic field and start spinning, and they create a magnetic induction of electrical pulse into anything electrical or anything metal. And that was what was happening to knock out the power system. Well, they said the long cable on the Minuteman missile that connects the stages was a perfect antenna for this interaction to happen, and our missile would be fried in flight and made impotent. The warhead would never arm, it would be worthless. And the Russians used this, instead of attacking us on the ground, the silos and the launch control facilities, by just a few nuclear detonations every few minutes, or one every few minutes above southern Canada, it would wipe out our missile system. And that was really serious, because this was a threat. Unlike what we had done with all the rest of our forces, we were tit for tat with them. Whatever they could do, we would do. So it didn't matter who started the fight. Both sides were going to lose. We had mutually assured destruction. That's what kept us from ever going to war. It was really a good thing. But this unbalanced it, because we were vulnerable. The Russians were not. They weren't, because we were smarter than them. We were so smart, we had built our missile using integrated circuits, which were very susceptible to currents. The Russians were using vacuum tubes in their guidance system, which were not susceptible to electromagnetic pulse. So we couldn't counter with our own threat against them. So that made our Minuteman missile system, like, it really had things out of balance. You got to remember, in the mid-'60s, it was the height of the Cold War. This was serious stuff. I was stationed with people who had sat on the end of the runway during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are people who really believed we were that close to going to war, and we were that close. So it was all very real. So they said, we've got to fix the missile. Well, after several weeks went by, the program was making no progress. Remember, I'm over here in the electronics. I just kind of knew about it. Extremely highly classified. It's only because of the special position I was in that I knew about it, because it was so highly classified. But it wasn't going anywhere, so the general stopped all the effort, and he said, we're going to reorganize. And here comes the next step, where I never, ever should have been. He reorganized and reached over out of the missile system into the ground electronics, and I got picked, junior captain, to be the project manager to manage the fix on the missile. And what really made it tough, how many have been in the military? Here, okay, you'll understand this. All of the 9 members of the team that I was now put in charge of were lieutenant colonels and colonels. I was a junior captain. So that was a real challenge. But I tell you what, the one thing the Citadel taught me was in leadership is you just take charge. And that's what I did. And I'll skip over the rest of it. We got the job done. We hardened the missile, and I went on to be the project officer to develop a ground-based EMP detector, and I was the lead engineer in the design and build of an airborne unit to be mounted in the EC-135 aircraft. We got our information about how to go about designing it by traveling around the country and finding professors who were experts in lightning, because the pulse has a very similar characteristic to lightning. So we had to learn the definition of lightning to come up with the design of it. That was a whole nother story. But anyway, when I left the Air Force, I never talked to anybody about what I had done because it had been so highly classified that I just never, the family never knew about it, the kids never, I never said a word about it. And then about 6 years ago, it's about 7 now, I picked up a magazine and read an article in there about the vulnerability of our electrical grid system to an EMP. And I looked at that and I said, wow, we never thought about it. You got to remember in the 60s, I know some of you in here remember in the 60s, electricity was a luxury. It was not a necessity. Life's dependence on it wasn't what it is today. Today, third most important thing to sustaining life. The only two that are more important than electricity are air and water, because there'll be people who will live longer without food than they will without electricity. And so our world has changed. But I read this article and I said, gee, that's interesting. And they mentioned the Blue Ribbon EMP Commission in the White House that had put out this report. So I said, I wonder what they had to say about it. So I sent off for a copy of it. A couple of weeks later, it arrived, and it was on a Friday, I remember. And I got it, and I started reading it, and got interested, and I spent the weekend just reading this report. I was just mesmerized by it because I said, wow, this is good. These guys know what they're talking about. And I went through all of what they had. I said, this is really good. When I got through, I said, well, I wonder who wrote this thing. So I went back and looked at who the authors were, and there were the names of some of the same people that I had worked with when I was in the Air Force that had written this report as a part of the Blue Ribbon Commission on EMP. Then still, I had not gotten involved with getting to this insanity of running for office at that time. And so a little bit later, I was at an event on C-Scope. And there was a gentleman there who many of you know, Frank Gaffney. They're talking on education, but we got into a side conversation about this issue. I don't remember how it even started. And that got me really kind of thinking about it. And then right after the election, before getting in office in the election, I started talking to people, and I found out and I learned that Texas has its own grid, but wasn't doing anything about it, and that we need to do something about it. And then the next thing, one thing led to another, and next thing, we ended up with it writing a bill that the power companies opposed. That was one eye-opening exercise to find the power of the lobby, and the power companies opposed to it. But we did get a bill out of the Senate. It wasn't what I really wanted. It was fairly weak. But we did get it out of the Senate, but it got killed in the House. And so in the interim, we started that whole session. Nobody in Austin could even spell EMP. Honestly, they could not spell it. But we went from that to getting the lieutenant governor to make it an interim study. And I have met with the governor more than once now and discussed it, and he has made it a priority item for his office. Now, don't ask me to tell you what priority for his office means. I don't know. It's just what he said. And so, but I'll tell you this, I even have Democrats stop me in the hallway down in Austin in the interim, ask me how I'm coming with the EMP bill, because they recognize that there's no putting blood on the doorpost and having the death angel pass over with this. It's going to go after Democrats and Republicans and independents, and it's going to get you whether you voted or not. So, but anyway, that brings up the other issue. The EMP pulse has no impact on human life, on humans, animals, trees, birds, anything. It only creates a huge electrical current that is so big that will fry most of what we have, if not all of it, that's electronic. So let's go on to, that's enough of my bio. I just want to go over that to show you this is not something new to me. This is not something that, like the power companies tried to say, oh, that Hall, he must have read a Newt Gingrich book and they got excited about it. No, I knew about this long before Newt was even running for office. So go ahead to the next slide. We have 21 what we call critical infrastructure. It includes some things like our chemical plants, our communications, manufacturing, dams, nuclear reactors, transportation, all 21 of those. Only the electrical grid that's in the energy section is the only one that if we lose it, it wipes out all the rest of them. We could lose dams, we could lose a nuclear reactor, we could take down our transportation system, all of it. And it would not have the devastating impact of no electricity, nothing electrical operating. Go ahead, next. Now the neat news is, if you look up on the map there, we have basically 3 grid systems in the United States. You see the one to the east, one to the west, and then there's Texas. And Texas doesn't quite look like Texas because we have a little bit of the northwest and a little bit of the northeast part in which the grid comes in from across state lines. Can you hold it to the...
Well, but the reason I'm raising my hand now, Texas is not separate from the grid of the United States anymore, from what I found out.
That's
They're tied in.
only to the extent of the pieces in the northeast and the northwest, and we have power that we provide across our international border to the south into Mexico. But for purposes of being able to isolate our grid, we have our own, and the isolation, it's not just the physical part that's important, but policy-wise. We are not under national, the NERC or the FERC. We have our own ERCOT. So while the rest of the nation has to operate through NERC and FERC to make the changes necessary, Texas does not have to do that because we have, between the PUC and ERCOT, we have the authority to do whatever we want to do to our system. Next slide. We really have, when we talk about the electrical system, you can break it up different ways. This is the most common way where we start on the far right there, number 1, where you have the generating plants, whether it's natural gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, or whatever it is. And then we go with the long distance transmission where we have the large transformers, because to send electricity over long distances, you have to have very high voltage for the efficiency. But that takes these huge, what they call EHV, extra high voltage transformers that we don't even make here in the United States anymore. They take about 36 months to get, and we have to import them. And they weigh several thousand tons. But anyway, and then you have the transmission lines and then the step-down transformers to start getting ready to use it in the commercial or residential facilities where you have the smaller transformers. Go ahead, next slide. Walk through this. Go ahead and click on through this till we go to the next one. I kind of got ahead of it here. So I'm used to holding that clicker myself. So, okay, go ahead, next one. There are 3 threats that we have out there. We have the one I described earlier, that's what we call man-made, or one of the man-made, or nuclear. That's the nuclear version of the man-made, with a weapon detonated above the atmosphere so the gamma rays interact with the electrons in the atmosphere and the magnetic field. The second one is natural. Go ahead and click one more time. One more. Okay, the second one is natural. Most people know them as sunspots. They are coronal mass ejection, that's what it's referred to. These are huge nuclear actions coming off the sun. They happen all the time. They come off the sun in all directions, all different sizes. They've been around for a long time, and we have been impacted greatly by them. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then the third one is a non-nuclear version. And if you've seen there've been a half a dozen movies out where a non-nuclear version is a directed pulse. You can make it with components you can go pick up at any Radio Shack-like place, and it will be directed energy that will wipe out electronics. Several movies have been made where they use it to rob banks and do different things. They're very real. We have tactical weapons. Russians have them, use them. We have seen the effects of them, but they're all local. It's only the nuclear and the sun, the natural, that can have a widespread impact. The non-nuclear is probably about as effective as a cyber attack or a physical attack on a substation. Next one, next slide. Okay, I went over these. The test that we were in '62 that I mentioned was called Starfish Prime, and the Soviets called theirs the K Project. So you can go look those up, Google them. They're really interesting. Next. Well, back in 2000, Congress actually started investigation. They have been working on this since 2000. All the way up to today, we have a bill that just got passed out of the House. It's in the Senate. It's led by Trent Franks, congressman from Arizona, who has dedicated himself to trying to get an EMP bill out of the Congress. We're real close in the Senate. As soon as we can convince Rand Paul to take the hold off of it, we just might be able to get it to the floor of the Senate for a vote. But he has put a hold on it. And so folks up there, this is real time. This is what's happening right now. And there. Okay, next. Go ahead and click the next one. Okay. We know that Russia has had this capability for a long time. We know that China, we have captured documents. After Russia collapsed, we got a lot of information, intelligence from them. We actually got their copies of their war plans where they talk about using the EMP threat in their attack scenarios. China has actually hardened their electrical grid system around on the part of China that's right near nationalist China. So that'd give you a clue on how they plan to make one of their attacks. And we have North Korea. North Korea has said time and time again that they would like to use an EMP attack against America. We have captured documents from the Iranians in which they described an EMP in 22 different attack scenarios on the United States. They include the EMP as a part of their attacks scenario. We have watched the North Koreans develop a missile that was specifically designed to fly a trajectory that would be optimum for the delivery of a nuclear weapon for an EMP attack. We have watched the Iranians practice launching a medium-range missile off the back of a cargo ship, which would be ideal for delivering a nuclear weapon for an EMP attack on the United States. Go ahead, next one. This is about Trent Frank. I'll tell you, he is one of the most dedicated, hardworking people. He is as emphatic about this as our Louis Gohmert is about the Constitution. Go ahead, next one. This is the one I talked about, the ship. Sometimes referred to as a scud in a tub, a simple SA-2 type missile in which there are thousands and thousands of them out there, is all it would take. And we're talking about a handful of people, about a half a dozen. Take that missile, an old rusty cargo ship, and a nuclear weapon, launch it off the coast of Galveston. All it needs to do is get to 50 to 250 nautical miles somewhere over a central part of the United States. This is not an accuracy thing. This is not threading the needle. It's just get it up in the air somewhere over the United States. The higher it is, the more central it is, the more widespread the outage is going to be. At over 200 nautical miles, you get line of sight from coast to coast. That's where it's effective, line of sight. So a couple hundred nautical miles over Kansas. and you've got the entire United States blanketed. Go ahead, next one. This is not somebody's dream. We've actually intercepted a North Korean ship in the Panama Canal that had 2 SA-2 missiles with all the equipment to launch them coming through the Panama Canal, buried under several tons of sugar. That was actually captured there. Next one, that was in 2013. There are other ways. A simple weather balloon would do it. That would get it high enough. Simple weather balloon, and there's nothing cheaper than a weather balloon. You could do it with a high-performance aircraft and a zoom climb. Not as effective as getting to 250 nautical miles, but enough to do serious, serious damage. Next one. The military has known about this. Out of what we did on Minuteman, they developed actually nuclear hardened standards by which were used. They have been used for a long time now, from the early 70s, on our communications gear, sensitive electronics. Go ahead, next one. They started back in the 60s, right on up to today. And today, let's go to the next one. I think it's where I want to go. Most of you are familiar, during the Cold War, we had our command and control function in Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD, underneath the Cheyenne Mountain. Figure that's a safe place to be. At that time, we thought it would withstand a direct hit. When we finally figured out that it really wouldn't, they decided to move out. They quit the expense of staying in there in the mountain and shut it down. It's been shut down for well over 20 years now. This past year, the command structure of the military started the process of moving back into Cheyenne Mountain, spending almost $1 billion to retrofit it, refurbish it, rebuild it, and get it ready for the command structure, specifically because of the EMP threat. There's a number of articles out there you can Google and read about them. They're very interesting. The military is very aware of this threat. Next one. The natural. It's not something the scientists say, boy, that could happen. It has already happened. Matter of fact, the very first one, I think, try the next slide. Very first one happened in 1859. You say, well, we didn't have much in electronics in 1859. Oh, yes, we did. We had a telegraph system. And the telegraph system in both the United States and Europe was fried. Several people were injured, burned, as the current jumped off of the equipment and hit them. It even warped rail track. It was so intense. It lasted for about 12 days. Had that been today, it would have wiped us out from coast to coast. And just a few years back, there was a coronal mass ejection that they estimate was 10 times the size of the Carrington event. The one in 1859 was referred to as the Carrington event, named for the doctor that discovered it, so on. But in 1989, we were within 2 weeks of being in the right place in the orbit for that event to have intercepted the Earth. You see, when it goes off the sun, it goes off in various directions. If we're not in, one that goes off over that way and we're over here, it doesn't affect us. But one comes this way and we're there, it will have a huge impact. We were only 2 weeks. It was on our path, but it was 2 weeks ahead of us. That's getting pretty close. We've also experienced it, I believe it was in '89, when the big blackout in Quebec, Canada, the northeast part of the United States, it knocked it out cost them over $20 billion to repair the things that were destroyed. That was a sunspot. Next. Okay, that's what I just talked about. Next one. Okay. The interesting thing is that we really are getting a lot of help from different groups in trying to get enough attention brought so we can actually do something this next session. I've been working with Alan West. I think everybody here knows Alan West. We are scheduled to make a video together on this issue, but we've also gotten help from the Blaze. And go ahead to the next slide. And go ahead and click again. And they put this little short video together for us. You may have seen some of this. Oh.
An EMP is a massive electromagnetic pulse. It can be released from a nuclear device detonated at a high altitude, destroying electrical grids for hundreds of miles. The aftermath of such an attack could be devastating. Distribution of food and medicine would be nearly impossible. There would be a shortage of clean water, and first responders would be left with no means of communication. Now, this may sound like something out of an apocalyptic thriller, but this is not fiction. This is a critical national security issue that leaders from both parties take seriously, because they know that rogue nations and terrorist groups dream of a world without the United States.
After 9/11, Congress ordered a series of studies on weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, the EMP Commission delivered a report on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States.
And the EMP Commission published 5 reports, 3 were classified and 2 were unclassified. The 2 unclassified were in 2004 and 2008. They laid out a scenario where a very entry-level weapon in the 20 kiloton range was lobbed at not a very high altitude over Cincinnati, Ohio.
Michael Del Rosso is an engineer and Pentagon consultant. He has worked with the EMP Commission, and he has participated in confidential congressional briefings on nuclear threats to America.
And the reason they chose that target is because that weapon with the radius of line of sight at the altitude, which was a nominal altitude, would have covered 74.5% of all the electric generating capacity in the United States and 83% of the substations in the United States and the majority of the population.
Bill Graham, who was the chair, the one statement he made that I think needs to be remembered is EMP is one of a small number of effects that has existential consequences that could threaten the existence of the United States.
George Baker is Professor Emeritus of Applied Science at James Madison University. He sits on the Board of Advisors for the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security.
The effects could be so widespread that, in effect, you'd have breakdown of governance. In Bill Graham's testimony, he thought that upwards of 50% of the population would die within the first year.
For the Record has learned that in 1995, a Russian think tank presented a report to the Russian army recommending the military align with rogue nations, sharing both weapons of mass destruction and missile technology.
There was testimony in 2004 by Soviet flag officers that they rather sheepishly said that technology for super EMP weapons had actually leaked out to North Korea and other rogue nations.
We think enough word of it is leaked out, and it's not a very technically complex idea, that it could well be the case that the North Koreans could pull off something like that.
There's no one that will deny with any credibility that the reason why North Korea and Iran are self-professed emerging nuclear threats to the United States of America is because Russia and China want them to be and have enabled them to be. This is not idle thought. This is what nation states like Iran and North Korea have spent billions of dollars developing this capability. They're doing it for a reason, and they say the reason is the fact that they see the United States as their primary adversary.
On July 9, 1962, the United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean. It was called the Starfish Prime Test, and the electrical pulse from the blast was felt 900 miles away in the Hawaiian Islands. The data collected from that event showed the U.S. military the potential damage an EMP can cause, information they have had for more than 50 years.
After the Starfish Prime test, the U.S. government immediately took steps to protect military assets.
The Department of Defense, as they built out the Minuteman system, the ground system and the missiles, included EMP protection in the Minuteman system. It's been 50 years ago.
So we've hardened that capability tremendously, again, at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But our civilian grid, upon which 99% of the military's electricity in CONUS is dependent upon, it's essentially unprotected.
I think that's largely right. I think the only civilian systems that were hardened were the president's airplane and maybe some of his command and control, assuming you want to consider that civilian. But no one was thinking of protecting the civilian infrastructure.
And that is the great conundrum here for me, is that one of two things is true. Either the military has this wrong, and this is no problem, and therefore we should stop spending all the money to harden against it. Or if it is a problem, then we should harden the grid upon which the military depends for 99% of its electricity needs in this continent.
Nobody's in charge of the electric grid. Do you think Department of Energy? No. Department of Energy basically works on nuclear waste and funds nuclear laboratories. There's a small office that deals with electric grids, but nobody that has any real power. This is something that is not being dealt with. It is, improvements in it are fought by industry, and it's extremely frustrating because it's very dangerous to let this grid sit there the way it is while the Russians and Chinese have fully and completely protected theirs. Yes.
They're ready for one.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells you that on this issue, the Russians and Chinese are more responsible than we are.
In 2004, the Congressional EMP Commission estimated that it would take a one-time investment of $2 billion to harden the entire U.S. electrical grid against an EMP. Today, that estimate has actually been reduced to $500 million. That's less than 1% of what the Government Accountability Office reported was wasted in 2012. And that's our show for this evening. Thank you for joining us on For the Record. We'll see you next time.
Okay, the next one. Most of the folks that you saw in that, James Woolsey, ex-CIA director, Dr. Baker, others, were all at our two-day EMP summit that we held in Austin as a part of our interim study at the end of March. It was a fairly well-attended and the first time ever event in the United States to bring huge number of people together to actually talk about this threat. And we're talking about a complete loss of electricity beyond the ability to repair it. If you heard what he said up there, that means that if we went with 11 months, according to a government study, without electrical power, about 90% of the current population, or 300 million people, would die. So this is a very serious threat, and yes, and the very interesting thing is, this is not an expensive fix. We'll spend less money securing our electrical grid than the power companies wasted on smart meters, just to put it in perspective. In there, so go ahead to the next one. And think about it. Think about what you've got at home right now. Most people don't have a week's worth of groceries. Many people just don't have more than about 2 or 3 days worth. And with no electricity, there are no pumps to pump water, to pump fuel, to run the sewage plants. Automobiles built after about 1974 will not run. Their electronic ignitions will be wiped out. Now, your old riding lawnmower might survive, but your gas that you've got, unless you won't be able to get much more, except draining from tanks of cars that don't drive. If you have an ignition system that has points and condensers, it'll probably work, the old tractor. Yes, sir.
What about like these generators that work on solar energy? Are there any other options, like other things that you could survive on besides the solar panel, wireless, ones that are wireless? Are there other ones too, generators that you can survive on?
They're all going to need fuel, and then if you could protect one and then had the fuel, but for how long is your fuel going to last? Because there's no delivery trucks, and you're not going to have any truck to go get it. Put it in perspective. I made a comment one time. A group of people that will do the best at first in survival will be the Amish, because they don't use electricity. And then somebody pointed out and says, yeah, but they don't have any guns either. So they won't last long either. Here, let me finish up, and then I'll cover all your questions here. I'm getting near the end here. Okay, go ahead, next one. Go ahead, next. It'll be a collapse of society. You won't be able to get any money out of the bank. There will be no trucks to deliver more goods and so on. There won't be many automobile accidents because no cars will be running. But aircraft that are flying, they're coming out of the air. They're coming down. So, next. And this is an issue. I've talked to a number of first responder groups and talked about their plans that they have. You know, they all have really good plans for big fires, for floods, for tornadoes, for earthquakes even, and riots. And I asked each one of the group, and I said, okay, any one of these, tell me about your plans. How do you put it in action? He said, well, first what we do is we have our call list, and we put out our calls. I said, okay, what's your plan if you can't call anybody? And they'll look at me and say, well, that's how we start. I said, you don't have a plan. You can't implement it unless you can call. Because if that happens, I gave my phone up here a while ago. That's my phone. What was that? This will not work. Now this gets the millennium's attention when you tell them this happens. This is nothing more than a paperweight. They won't be able to text anybody either. So the first responders will have a really tough time, because after about 3 days, when food's running out at home and the kids are crying and the mother is upset trying to figure out what to do, our first responders are going to have a hard time leaving their family to go do their job. And many will. 3 days, 4 days, but how about 10 days? When the riots are in the streets and people are beating on the doors, are they going to go do that job or defend their family? It's going to be a really tough time if we aren't ready for it, if we aren't planning for it. And so that's one of the reasons I've become a member of InfraGard, which is a organization it's a mixture of business and FBI that plans on things. They have a whole special group for EMP, and we're working with some other groups to develop plans for this. Next. Good, I covered that. Okay. After all that doom and gloom, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. This is not as bleak as what it looked like last time. Next. There are products on the market. We're in the process of identifying them. I'm developing lines of communication with countries that have actually started their installation process, Israel being one of them. A lieutenant governor was over there a few weeks back, and he got a briefing on what Israel is doing to harden its grid today. And we know about what the Arab Emirates are doing to harden their grid. We know what the South Koreans have already done in hardening their grid. We know what the Chinese have already done. We know what to do. We know how to do it. It's just a matter of stepping up to do it. This is not something that's going to take a lot of scientific research to go figure it out. We know what to do. There are companies that manufacture the products. We just need to do it. And basically, it has to do with grounding, surge protectors, not unlike what you use on your computer today, and what they call a Faraday shield, which is basically a metal enclosure to put equipment in it. That's basically what it will take. And we know how to do it and what to do. It's just a matter of the will to do it. Next. This is what's standing in our way. And this is where I'm just not politically correct, but I call a spade, and this is what it is, and this is why we aren't getting anywhere. It is the unholy alliance that exists. And I didn't put the power companies at the top of that alliance by accident. They are in control of what's happening. Here in Texas, we have ERCOT and the PUC. At the federal level, we have NERC and FERC, the power companies at the top. The power companies control everything NERC and FERC does, and ERCOT and the PUC doesn't do anything without the power companies' concurrence and permission. And they sure don't like to hear that. But they have worked together in what I call an unholy alliance, a cabal, to keep this on the back burner and to put out false and misleading information about how serious the threat is and whether anything can be done about it. And that's what we have to overcome. That's our biggest obstacle right there. Next to convincing legislators who aren't quite understanding what this is the next thing biggest we have to overcome. Go ahead. Next. Progress we've made. We actually got this in the Republican platform. This was the first time an effort had ever been made to get it into the platform. And we did it. And that's the words that were actually in there, where we address the cyber attack, the physical attack, the geomagnetic, which is the sun, and the nuclear, the EMP. It's in the Republican platform. So we've got a good reason for any Republican to vote for it. But it is not, this is a bipartisan issue. This is not something of Republicans versus Democrats at all. And a good many of the Democrats recognize that. Go ahead, next one. So, here's how you can help. Make sure, because politicians don't like to do things that they don't think they have the support of the people doing. And that's one of the things I've learned up there, and I think Stuart would agree with that, is that if they think that they're sticking their neck out to do something new, they're unlikely to do it. But if they think they have widespread support for something, that's someone who will do anything if they think the people will support it. But what it is, they need to know that you do support this. Your reps, your senators, lieutenant governor, governor, and the PUC and ERCOT and your electric power company, whoever you get your power from, you need to call them, you need to write them, you need to let them know. This is part of we the people government. Here's where we the people get involved. Because this is the first time I said you will make a choice on helping to either elect or defeat Hillary. You'll make a second choice, totally unrelated. You will leave here tonight, enjoy the entertainment, maybe talk about it to a neighbor, and go home and can't wait till the next meeting, come back and be entertained again on another subject. Or you will leave here and actually go do something. You will either do something or not do something. And I can tell you that doing nothing will not help get this to happen. If you are seriously concerned about the continuation of life in the United States of America, and I don't mean to be gloom and gloom, but I truly believe that this is the serious threat. I'm just amazed it hadn't happened already. It is so easy to do. you will go home and you will write and call all of those people up there. I'll make it easy. You don't need to write me. I get it. I get it. Send the letters to Kay. Send them to her. No, she gets it too. No, you don't need to do that. So that'll save you. That'll save you one stamp right there. In there, but all the rest. And unfortunately, I can tell you, if Stuart was going to be back down there with me, which unfortunately he isn't, I can tell you don't need to write him either, because he gets it. But that's another issue. So, all right. Good. Next slide. I think this. Yeah, this is what you've been waiting for. All right. Yes, sir. Back.
All right. How do we write the formal letter? Word it for us so that we don't sound like a bunch of rednecks.
It doesn't have to be complicated. 2-3 sentences, all it would take. I'm very concerned about the security of our electrical grid system and the EMP threat. Please do something about it. You don't have to explain it to them. I mean, they've kind of heard it from me. They needed to hear it from you, and it's real simple. They just describe it, and please do something. I mean, it's like I get.
Can I rebut back real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm on the phone, so I wrote my letter, just like that. I'm on the phone. What are you concerned about? How do I explain that without having diarrhea of the mouth?
Okay, if you will go to my website, I've got 4 articles up there, each one fairly short, that describe what I did here tonight. It gives you all the information that you really need to talk about it. And you're really concerned about losing our electrical grid to a terrorist attack using one nuclear weapon, or nature doing the same thing because we aren't prepared for it. See, our grid system was never built with the thought that anybody would ever attack it. It's not something that there was ever any real thought put into it, and it has grown like topsy. I mean, when you think about it, we have components of our electrical grid system, as things have grown, it's just been added to and added to and added to, and what's over here is quite different than what's over here, because this is what's being made today. But it all works together. It's very fragile. But we have made some significant improvements. I'll tell you some of the things that they have done. You remember when the power used to go out, when there would be a transformer knocked out, and they might have to get that transformer back online before your power came back on? But in the last couple of years, you've noticed that you get a couple of seconds blink of light. It may go off and it comes right back on again within a few seconds. That's technology being brought into it. And rather than having to make the shifting, the switching by hand, they've gone to using computers to redirect power so that the outages are down less, because there are so many businesses and other people that are so dependent on continuous electrical service that it's become very necessary to do that. So here we go. I got one over here, and I'm coming back. I'll stay here till I've answered all the questions. So,
okay,
yes.
TJ Scott is watching on Facebook Live and has a question. He says, why did it die in the House last session?
It didn't have sufficient support from the House members to bring it to the floor. And there were members of the House that would specifically stepped up to try to block it.
Would you be willing to name names on which of those?
There were a number of them. It really doesn't matter who it was. It's the real problem there were insufficient number of House members that understood how significant this issue is. So there was no pressure to bring it to the floor from the House members over there. Okay, wait a minute. I'll come back over here and I'll come back. Yes, sir.
I was in the Air Force from 60 to 64, and then Englewood Air Force Base, because I was nav aides, they had a nice fat Faraday cage. I'm just wondering what you think about making one, not for your whole house, but say 8 or 10 foot square or something like that, put things in. And I understand now there are some aluminum oversized bags that you can get to put some of your electronics in too to protect it.
You can Google it on the internet. You can find plans for building Faraday cages. You can find folks that manufacture them, make them, and sell them. Yes. Dave.
What's the power company's motivation to resist hardening the system?
I think we have executives in the power company that are more interested and concerned about their paycheck and bonuses than they are about protecting the people. And I think their attitude is, if this were really to happen, there'd be nobody around to sue them. If the power company executives wanted this to happen, it would happen in a heartbeat. Okay, yes?
All right, the PUC, I can't remember, is that appointed or elected?
No, those are appointed. All of ERCOT, all of that, there's no elected officials in that. Those are all appointed. Those are state offices that are.
Okay, is Mexico hardening their grid?
No. You kidding? No. No, they're using.
We're the largest country in the world that hasn't? We're the largest country in the world?
No, there's a lot of Europe that hasn't, and China has only done part of theirs, and I really don't have any information on what Russia has done.
We've done nothing.
No, we have done absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And what really concerns me is that this is not something that people keep making or say, theoretically, this might, we captured or boarded a North Korean ship. We have witnessed the Iranians practice launching a nuclear a missile off the back of a cargo ship. We have, I'm sorry, I left out one other. In April of 2013, there was a well-organized military attack on a major substation in Southern California, Central California, Palo Alto. They shot up a substation. They estimate that it could have been as many as 16 special forces type people. There's been an investigation in it and said this was a well-structured attack. It came within one circuit of knocking out the power in about a fifth of California. On that same day, North Korea launched a weapons-grade satellite on a south polar orbit. That's an orbit that comes around from the south and over the United States, back down, coming up from the south. All of our defenses are pointed to the north for the Russians and the Chinese. This came across the United States on that same day. In January of this year, the Chinese launched their second weapon-grade satellite on a similar orbit. So we now have 2 satellites crossing the United States twice a day, each one of them, in a south polar orbit. And at our summit, some of the folks were there, like James Woolsey with the CIA and others, who pointed out that we have been monitoring those satellites and neither one has sent one piece of data back to Earth since it was launched. It means only one of 2 things. Either neither one of them worked and they're dead, or there are weapons waiting to be activated. They don't send data back. That's happening today. Those satellites should have been shot down the day after they were launched. But our leadership in Washington chooses otherwise. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. There's a good book called The Darkest Hour, and it goes through a lot of this stuff, as well as provisions, things to do, things to have, how to do it, building Faraday cages. It talks about that very extensively. If people are interested in looking into that.
Okay. There's also another good book called 1 Second After, written by a professor in North Carolina, that describes the first 12 months after an EMP attack. I found it to be an excellent book, very realistically written about what takes place. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious as to why our grids are like they are. Why are they so, we only have 3 majors, and if one goes out, it knocks out half the country. Why is it still like that? That just blows my mind.
Well, it
It
is.
has to do with money, doesn't it?
Well, everything has to do with money. But part of it has to do with redundancy and reliability in a benign environment.
Yeah, but why would they tie them together? That's the thing I don't.
That, for just that, for reliability. So when one goes down, when you have to take them off for a line for maintenance, which many of them have to come offline quite often for maintenance, you can pick up power from another one. It has to do with being able to maintain a high reliable source of power. See, many manufacturers cannot tolerate 1 second of power outage. Texas Instruments said 1 second of power outage for them cost them a minimum of $75,000. And many manufacturers, if they're in their manufacturing process, if they have a power interruption, they got to throw the whole lot out from beginning to end and start over again. So it's very expensive, very important to have a very reliable system, which brings me to the point that I didn't point out, and that is the really positive side of us stepping up and doing this. You know, Texas takes a lot of pride in being, I think Rick Perry traveled all over the place saying, come on down, we're open for business, move to Texas. Well, we managed to give away a lot of money, bribing companies to move here. We call it the Enterprise Fund, and we call it tax abatements and things like that to try to bribe companies to come here. Think about this as an incentive. If Texas were to harden its grid and then put a sign up that says, hey, when the lights go out, they're going to be back on in Texas first. Or maybe when the lights go out, they're only going to blink in Texas. Come on down. There's not a business we could start charging them extra to move here, I think.
Why do we want them?
That's a whole nother subject. In there. Yes, ma'am.
Well, lady in the corner. I mean, if we protect the Texas grid, aren't we vulnerable to the rest of it? No. To the whole nation?
No, we're isolated. We can isolate our grid. Now, we're going to have more problems than our southern border if that were to happen, but at least we would be in a position, because see, what the real problem we have is if we lose, we've had massive power outages like Katrina, the Northeast, but that left a lot of the United States to be able to come in and help. With power out everywhere, there's no cavalry. At least with Texas, we got a starting point. Yes, ma'am.
I got a question. When you were talking about that triangle with the power companies and the other two, did it hurt us as far as our EMP vulnerability and stuff like that when we deregulated
No.
the electric companies?
Unrelated, no. No. Larry?
Are electronics that are not turned on now, are they?
Nope. Yep.
It gets both AC and DC.
Yes. It is basically a DC current it is a DC current, but it's a very large DC current operating on things that aren't supposed to have DC current in them, and that's what ends up really frying it. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that Rand Paul was kind of putting a hold on that in Congress. Do you know what his reason would be?
I can only know indirectly. It has to do with there's a provision in there that allows the power companies to classify some of the things that they're doing, so that, and their argument is, if we let everybody know everything we're doing, then as fast as we do something, they'll figure out some way to do something against it. His argument has been is the power companies have used secrecy to falsify information for rate-based decisions. And now we're giving them an opportunity and covering them with national defense secrecy, which would make it worse. He's got a legitimate concern, but I think it's some of these things we have to decide which is most important. And like Benjamin Franklin said, with liberty and security, that's the issue.
Well, just think about one more question, and then you'll stay around.
Yeah.
If you want to talk.
Okay, right now I have my solar generator in a metal trash can lined with cardboard, and then I have my small components wrapped in aluminum foil also on top of that. Is that any
as far as I understand, you're doing, what you're talking about doing is supposed to work.
Okay. What about the microwave? Because they said you would put things in the microwave.
Yes. A microwave is basically a Faraday shield that keeps the same kind of energy inside. And so I'm talking about, you're going to use one that's unplugged. Yeah, don't plug it in. Don't turn it on with it in there. But one way you can test what you've got is take your cell phone and wrap it up just like you did anything else and put it in there, and then make sure the ringer's on, and then call it and see if it answers. That's that's what I was told was a good test there. Now here comes the questions that I can't answer.
Well, mine's not a question, mine's a statement, and it's near and dear to my heart, it's to you. When he said, how do I make a call? I'm sending, like to Austin. It's just near and dear to my heart that do not worry if you think you are gonna sound like a redneck. You are a Texan, you have every right.
Redneck or not.
It is your state, your concern. And I have been in Bob's office and other offices before when Hot Topics were up, and it is amazing. I have seen that the staff just takes phone calls, one right after another, and they record this. So never let anybody intimidate you. You have a right to do that.
Oh, I'm not intimidated. I just don't want to sound like it.
Don't worry
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. The- yeah. No.
We need, not just on this effort, but we need concerned citizens to tell respectfully to the members what we want. And I'm just a we, he wants
No, I
to
got to listen to what's going on one time, and I called them, and I promised that poor person on that phone, heard me griping and complaining, and man, I thought, I just sounded horrible. I wasn't belligerent or nothing, but I lost my temper. You know.
No. No, and I'll say, don't, when you call, do be very respectful and just express it. And I would say that the overwhelming majority of the folks.
they're not the problem, they're the ones listening. Just give them
All right. They handle those phone calls, and but I think if you just explain to them, you don't have to get before, because they really are too busy to try to engage or discuss or convince you you're wrong. I would say, I know in our office and others I deal with, it's like they want to hear what you have to say. They're not there to argue with you about it. They want to know how you feel about it, because all that comes back as an input. And what Kay's talking about, she's been there. We take and go through the list and say, okay, what are people saying? You know, what is it that they feel? As an example, now you got other thing, but I just want to tell you, we had a bill last session that had to do with schools and teachers. And there was an organization that took and warped that bill and put out the most gosh-awful news thing on it that completely described something entirely different than what was really in that bill. I mean, they had us, we were cutting teachers' pay to $29,000 a year. We were taking away tenure. We were doing this and that. And, none of it was true. And we had teachers calling up. They can get aggressive on the phone, I tell you. They'd calling up. And so we would just keep talking to them and explain that what they had was bad information and explain it to them in there. But just call and describe it here.
Is this the correct information?
Yeah, we've got, now, what I was going to say is we're passing the clipboard around. If you will, if you get on that clipboard, I will email you a sheet that has the links, the phone numbers, and the email addresses for these organizations, everything except your power company. It'll give you, it'll have it there for ERCOT and the PUC and for the governor and for the lieutenant governor, and they hate me for this, but I'm doing it anyhow in there. So anyway, one more. And then,
I understand vacuum tube radios are not affected by this, but by the same token, cell phones are gonna be knocked out. What about the old pulse dialer phones?
They're depending on electricity to run. Nothing electrical will operate.
But phone line is DC.
It's electrical. It's electrical. Nothing electrical. The telegraph was DC. Nothing electrical will work. Give me. Yes, sir.
Might be a dumb question, but say around election time, this happens. Okay, how do we know that our government is going to stand up for us? I mean, how do we, we're sitting up. I mean, how do we know? How do we know that they're not, that other countries are not going to send a nuclear weapon over and we're fried in?
We'd be here all night talking about that one. I don't know. Larry, one more. Ray's going to run us out of here.
We know that money talks. And if it were explained to the electric companies how many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars it's going to cost them to replace those step-up transformers, then why wouldn't they have a selfish interest in spending some of their money and fixing the problem so that they're not going to be out of business for 3 years waiting on the transformer to come from offshore or something? Maybe we could approach them with that avenue.
I've tried that. I mean, they seem to have convinced themselves it is not going to happen, and if it does happen, nobody's going to be there to be able to prosecute them for it. Ray he's going to run me off here, but I'll stick around. If you got some questions, I'll come talk to you. Thank you. No, but wait a minute. Thank the person that really keeps me going. You heard what she asked tonight. I get those same horrible questions that just keep me going back trying to find the answers from her as she critiques what I do all the time, and I couldn't do it. She was with me today when we escaped from the People's Republic of Austin to come back up here. So, thank you.